seats. We will begin with some recorded remarks by the managing director, followed by opening statement by first deputy managing director Gita Gopinath, and then transition directly to the first session. So settle in, welcome, and let's get started.
Good morning and welcome to the 25th Jacques Polak Annual Research Conference. 25 years is a huge milestone, and I want to give you my heartfelt congratulations and thanks to the research department and Pierre Olivier for all you have achieved over the past quarter century. Over that time, we've had our ups and downs, periods of high and low growth, profound changes in the global economy, and crisis. Through it all, this annual research conference has shed light on some of the most difficult questions facing our profession, helping policymakers navigate the most complex challenges. My task is to honor this incredibly distinguished history. The first annual research conference was under Michael Musa. It was the year 2000 when Maury Obstfeld laid out a new international macroeconomics research agenda looking beyond the Mundell-Fleming model at the Mundell-Fleming lecture, no less. This work has had profound implications for modern economic policy and people's lives, influencing how countries manage exchange rates, international trade, and respond to economic crises. That was 15 years before Maury became chief economist. After Michael came Ken Rogoff, whose accomplishments we celebrated here last year. Then, under Raghu Rajan's leadership, the ARC focused on fundamental issues that remain highly relevant today, from exchange rate regimes to capital flows and structural reforms. These insights were crucial in guiding policymakers' responses to mitigate the impact of the global financial crisis. The next ARC explored the latest factors impacting exchange rates and examined their policy implications. It was led by Simon Johnson, who we are proud to say is now a Nobel laureate. Afterwards, Olivier Blanchard's record-setting run of 7 ARCs began at the height of the global financial crisis. And in the years that followed, it was only natural that many of these ARCs allowed us to reflect on macroeconomic and financial policies in the shadow of the crisis. They tackled pressing challenges like financial frictions and unconventional monetary policy, which were critical in shaping our response to the Eurozone crisis and refining our policy advice in abnormal times. That work made us better prepared for the shocks of the past 5 years. Gita's ARCs were shaped by the pandemic. They helped us better incorporate epidemiology into macroeconomic models early in the COVID crisis and later gave insight into pandemic's impact on capital flows. And with Pierre Olivier's stewardship, we have written a new playbook to help countries address the challenges of the post-pandemic, climate-impacted world, including inflation and elevated debt. This year, we continue the ARC's tradition of excellence, I am sure, as you rethink the policy toolkit in a turbulent global economy. The profound shocks of COVID and war have left us with inflation and fragmentation, on top of the need of economic growth to address challenges from poverty to climate change. Yet the growth outlook, while stabilizing, remains much lower than pre-pandemic. Inflation has declined, but has not been fully defeated. and elevated debt levels constrain fiscal space, especially in countries that most need to spend to educate their young populations, build infrastructure, and increase their climate resilience. This conference will focus on how to address these and other challenges that central banks and fiscal authorities face, and what the international community can do together. With Gita, Pierre-Olivier, and the fabulous REST team in the lead, you are in great hands, and I wish you the best for an illuminating, productive conference. Over to you, Gita.
Hello and welcome everyone to the 25th Jacques Polak Annual Research Conference. Let me join Kristalina in congratulating the research department on the 25 years of this conference, and of course Pierre-Olivier's leadership over the last few years has been immensely important to the success of these conferences. The topic of this conference is absolutely appropriate. We live in turbulent times. We expect the next several years to remain turbulent, and so it is a time for us to rethink the policy toolkit. We've had 4 years of unique shocks. The pandemic was unlike anything we'd seen in 100 years. We had Russia's invasion of Ukraine in Europe, again something that was unprecedented in a long time. And the energy crisis that it triggered and the cost of living effects that we were seeing all around the world. So it's certainly not been quiet times, it's been busy times, shock-prone times, and we expect that will last. So while it's going to take many years of careful research to figure out what the takeaways are from these past few years, we are in a place where we can discuss some lessons learned already. So I'm going to make basically 3 sets of points. The first is on rethinking the policy toolkit for inflation. As you know, we've seen a few years of inflation shooting up, and then now we expect it to return back to central bank targets for many countries next year, all else equal. Now, that hasn't happened easily, because if we policymakers who were trying to make decisions at the time of how to react to this rise in inflation initially were relying on the old toolkit, where you assumed that the Phillips curve was flat and that trade-off between inflation and output was flat, and you could assume that was going to be the case. And what the pandemic basically showed us was that that was not the best of assumptions. While indeed, if you looked at the wage Phillips curve, you could continue to assume that it was flat. The price Phillips curve certainly wasn't, and it was also a consequence of different sectors being hit by supply shocks and the compounding of those effects leading to a steepening of the price Phillips curve. And therefore, even without there being much movement in unemployment rates, you saw a big surge in inflation. So again, going forward, we should make sure that we're not fighting the last battle. The next time there is pressures on inflation, it doesn't mean that this is, again, now a new episode of a pandemic-like inflation cycle. It could be very different. And therefore, hitting that sweet spot between, how do we adapt our frameworks, deal with what we've learned without fighting the last battle is going to be very important. Now, there are many countries for whom inflation is not just about, while the policy rate remains the main tool for which central banks use for their macro stabilization and for inflation, in emerging and developing countries, they get a much more complicated set of outcomes. You have capital flow volatility, and all of that can lead to sudden stops in capital flows. That has implications for the real economy, has implications for inflation through exchange rate depreciations. And so there's a much more broader toolkit that central banks in many parts of the world, many open economies use, which goes beyond the policy rate. And that's, again, something to delve into more deeply. The second big area is on fiscal policy. And we now live in a world where debt is extremely high. We have overall debt number in trillions of dollars is expected to be $100 trillion this year, 2024. And by 2030, it's projected to keep increasing to reach about 100% of global GDP. So these are high debt levels. This is certainly not the last shock the world will face. There will be more. So there is a very important question of how to build up fiscal buffers, how to make sure that fiscal policy is in line with what the macro environment needs, how to make sure that this debt is sustainable, and all of this to be done in an environment where there are big spending needs that still are there, especially coming with structural transformations, the climate transition, digital, AI, and of course countries who have some very serious debt distress issues to deal with. So this is not going to be simple. While fiscal consolidation we view as unavoidable, countries will have to manage this quite carefully, make sure that they are doing the adjustment while helping to ensure that growth is not impaired in a big way. And so the timing is important, the sequencing is going to be important, what kinds of instruments you use is going to be very important. So doing this in a growth-friendly way, and IMF research has contributed to that, will be very important. The second, of course, is to have guardrails, which is to make sure you have the right medium-term fiscal frameworks, independent fiscal advisory councils, to ensure that it is time-consistent for governments around the world to actually commit to these kinds of good policies. And then the last piece is what we refer to as grassroots, and that's the last point I'm going to make, which is the interaction between politics and economics. Again, while growth has held up and is resilient, as Kristalina said, it's not a great number, which means that many countries are dealing with high debt and low growth. And to be able to then also manage their fiscal front is going to require some very careful working with society to ensure that the measures are acceptable and that they don't lead to social unrest. And this is not going to be easy, but that interaction is going to be absolutely critical. And similarly, on the interaction of politics and economics, there is the global cooperation front. There are many issues that cross borders, be it climate, be it AI, and that's going to require there to be coordinated solutions, and that requires cooperation. And again, that requires an intelligent way of dealing with both politics and economics. So I'm going to stop with that and look forward to this conference and the insights it provides us to think about all these issues, and just wishing everybody the very best for the next day, today and tomorrow, in terms of hoping that you get the best out of this conference. So with this, I am going to hand over to Emine Boz, who is the division chief in the research department, who will chair the first session. Thank you and welcome everyone.